Today we talk to
Charles Neidich.
Where are you from?
I am from New York City, Manhattan.
How did you come to the clarinet?
There's a long and short of that, but I come from a musical family. My mother was a pianist and my father a clarinetist. So I started on both instruments when I was just a baby. And my father, though, was unusually sensitive and good teacher, because generally parents cannot teach their children to music. It usually does not work. And my mother would taught me the piano, but she was perhaps too strict. My father was very creative. That's why the piano is my hobby and the clarinet is my instrument. I could say a little more because my father actually, probably when I was maybe 3 years old, of course I don't even remember exactly when, he started me on the mouthpiece. And then I graduated to an E-flat clarinet, and then to a C clarinet, and finally to a B-flat clarinet.
Can you talk to us about Irving Neidich?
My father was from New Jersey. He was born in New Jersey. That's right across the Hudson River from New York City. His parents came a long time ago. This was in 1905. They came from Pinsk, which is in Belarus now. At the time, it was part of Russia, and so they came to New York. Then my mother is from Greece, and she came with a scholarship. This was after the Second World War. She came to the United States to continue her studies in piano. And they met at the Manhattan School of Music in New York City. My father was auditioning chamber music partners. So I guess they became partners for more than chamber music. Now, one interesting thing is that my father was very active in contemporary music. And he played premieres of many pieces. He played premieres, for instance, of several pieces of Villa-Lobos, Hector Villa-Lobos, other composers, of composer Milton Babbitt, very important American composer, and others. Now, my parents also had a chamber ensemble, and this is actually very interesting, in a certain way very curious, because it turns out that they played the premiere of many works at Carnegie Hall in Manhattan, New York City. And these works included, for instance, the Beethoven Piano and Wind Quintet, Opus 15, which was perhaps performed in New York somewhere, but not at Carnegie Hall. So I discovered pieces like that Mozart Piano and Wind Quintet, Schubert Octet, other pieces like that, these which are really classics. You would think that they would have been performed all the time in New York City, but apparently, at least in Carnegie Hall, which is the big venue, they were not until my parents actually performed them. And that was maybe in 1960s, 1950s. So this is, you can see, in terms of chamber music, in a certain sense, New York City was a latecomer, at least in these very important venues, such as Carnegie Hall. So that's the sort of short story about my parents.
What is never missing in your clarinet case?
That's very funny. Clarinets. Well, actually, I should say maybe sometimes they're missing, but only when I'm playing them. And other usual things. I guess I always have some reeds, especially bad ones, and hopefully cork grease, for instance. These are things that clarinet players will appreciate, and other people will go, huh? What are those things? I have many, many bad reeds.
Any advice that someone gave you and changed your life?
That's a very difficult question, because many people gave me different kinds of advice. And to think about choosing something that wouldn't take several hours to explain, much longer than the advice, actually, it's a little bit difficult. So I would say perhaps one bit of advice which I received, and I received that from my father. He says, choose your way, simply that. And maybe that was became sort of the beginning, or that, let's say, was the fundamental advice, which then a lot of other people's advice built on.
Who were your clarinet teachers?
This has also a short and a long. I mentioned already that I started with my father. After I was a certain age, he thought I should study with someone else. At that time, I said, no, I don't want to bother. But he said yes. And he sent me to the great teacher, Leon Rushanov. And I studied with him later when I was in high school and as a teenager. And then after I went to college, right after, I went to study at the Moscow Conservatory, Tchaikovsky Conservatory. And there I studied with a clarinet teacher whose name was Boris Dikov, who's a very nice, wonderful fellow. But I should say that in many ways, my principal teachers were not clarinetists. And in important cases, they were not even people who I knew personally. So, first of all, when I was in Moscow, I studied with also, I should say, I coached with and got to know and had conversations with a wonderful pianist whose name was Kirill Lvovich Vinogradov. And the story about him is a long story about him, which I'm not going to get into here. But in any case, when I knew him, he taught, I should say, accompanying, that's right, or a collaborative piano, they say, as they say now, at the Moscow Conservatory. He was also the head vocal coach of the Bolshoi Theater at that time. But he was a remarkable pianist, really on the level of Sviatoslav Richter. I actually had the privilege of knowing just a little bit also, Richter. But Vinogradov was a very important teacher for me. And it's, I think, often very good to study or play for someone who doesn't play your instrument, because that person does not have the preconceived notions of what is difficult, what is possible, etc., etc. So they have a clearer musical, well, I should say, sense of what you should be doing, for instance, as the student, you see. So I think he was an important teacher for me. But now, there were other musicians who were very important for me. And these musicians were perhaps, well, I should mention one other person first, who was an oboist, Robert Bloom, who was a wonderful musician, and he was also important for me. And a conductor, this is when I was a student in college at Yale, these were both there, whose name was Otto Werner Müller, who was very important for me in showing how to look at music, how to look at the text in not simply a theoretical way, but in a very practical way. And that's sort of been my credo since that point till now. But maybe even more important for me were musicians such as, well, let me see, who should I do? Fritz Kreisler, violinist. Jascha Heifetz, violinist. Arthur Schnabel, who is maybe more important for me than perhaps any other musician, pianist. Okay, Rachmaninoff, pianist, you see. And these people, of course, except for Heifetz, who I did actually attend a concert of his when I was quite little, that these people I only knew from recordings. Also, conductor Arturo Toscanini, you see. So it's sort of the history of performance was very important for me. Enrico Caruso, I can tell that, the unbelievable tenor. The list goes on with these people. And what is very important is, let's say I go back to Fritz Kreisler. When I was, this is already very early. I don't know if I was in junior high school. My father had recordings. He loved recordings. He had records of these people. At that time, we had records. Now we don't even have CDs anymore. We just have streaming, which is in a way unfortunate, because after the stream, things just disappear into cyberspace. Now so I had records. So I record of an early the first recording that Chrysler made of the Beethoven violin concerto, for instance. This is with an orchestra conducted by Leo Blech. This was probably the late 1920s. I don't know exactly when that recording was made, and it's not important. But in that recording, Chrysler does one scale like a particular way, and I thought, that is fantastic. I have to try to play that way, the scale, even though I play the clarinet and not the violin, you see. So I would grab little things from these great performers' performances on record, and they would be in my mind, a particular kind of nuance. And I would try to make that nuance my own, for instance. Much later, this is actually very recently, I became great friends with the brilliant cellist and scholar and Baroque expert, Anner Bilsma, from the Netherlands. But he was also a remarkable musician, and we had many, many discussions together. We played together also. And we even made recordings together. But he had this great take on education, and where he said that you can hear something for just a couple seconds, and that can change your life. And on the other hand, you can study for years and nothing will happen, you see. So it's important to pay attention to the moment that something happens that will, you see. That also happened to me with another person who became a very good friend of mine, Heinz Holliger, the great oboist and composer as well. And perhaps later in the interview, I will talk about that. But there was also this moment with him where he just made one suggestion to me. This was the very first time we met, which I don't even quite remember. I think it was in 1978. That's a while ago. He just said one thing, and it's like what happened, a light bulb went off, there. And that changed the way I play. So this is the medium answer. Here.
Can you talk to us about your premieres of Elliot Carter?
I have had relationships with many great composers. With Carter, perhaps the closest, because we became very good friends, even to the extent that very late in his very long life, we celebrated his birthdays with him at our house. Came over, we had although I knew Carter before, we really came to know one another, each other, I should say, in 1993. At that time, he was composing his work for solo clarinet, which is called Gras, of course, and that's become quite a popular piece, which makes perfect sense because it's quite a great work. So he was composing Gras, and I had been connected with him by the person David Starobin, who was going to record the piece. So he asked if I would do the premiere recording, and so then we started with correspondence, and Carter sent me actually periodically different versions of the work as he was completing it. So from between the very first version of that I have and the final version, there are very interesting differences, which I have. It's very nice to see and nice that I actually have them. But then once he had pretty much finished the work, I went to play for him. And then the first thing that happened after that is there's one multiphonic in this work, which is a 12th, written F sharp to C sharp. But the fingering, which was in it, he had taken from this book by Bruno Bertolozzi. I don't know if you know this book. Bertolozzi wrote basically the first book about multiphonics for wind instruments, and that book is divided into a section for flute, oboe, clarinet, and bassoon. And several problems with a lot of the fingerings that he wrote, not only for clarinet, but for the other instruments. But personally, of course, I knew from the clarinet part. But I forgot when he wrote that book. Yeah, here's the book. This was the book that when composers first began experimenting with multiphonics. This was the source that they used. This is the book that even Carter had. I just show you just one thing, so you can see a page from it, for instance. And let me see when this was written. This is interesting. See, my father got this book for me when I was still in high school. Yeah, 1967. This book, it paved the road for composers to begin to be interested in expanding the tonal palette of wind instruments, and for performers also to try to figure out more how in fact to expand. But the book had many limitations also, that in terms of how to produce the sounds, et cetera, et cetera. And one thing specific to the clarinet, and this is kind of curious and in a certain way, I always thought it was kind of cute, although I think many people didn't think so. In Italy, until fairly recently, and probably it's not recently because this is already the 21st century, but into way past the middle of the century, of the 20th century, in Italy, clarinetists most often used an instrument which was called a full berm system, which had a low written E flat as well, went one half step lower there. And this book actually uses fingerings, including that low E flat, which, of course, basically people don't use. So, Luciano Berio in his Sequenza also has a multiphonic, where that E flat is very important. So you need an extension if you don't have that particular instrument. There was a recomposition, maybe by Berio, maybe not really by Berio, of that section, which I think is not worthwhile doing because it doesn't actually fit the tonal structure of the work. I say this as a warning to clarinet players who are going to play this piece or study this piece, that they instead have to put an extension into the bell to use that. And actually there is enough time to do that. So that's possible. Anyway, so now Carter, we go back to 1993, and the fingering that he wrote included, for this multiphonic, included that low E flat key, which in fact you don't need to use in order to produce that multiphonic. But of course he didn't know that, he's not a clarinetist, he just got it from the book. And what happened to him was once he had finished the piece but right before it was published, it was before it was published, he got all these crazy, we can't do this fingering because we have this low E flat. What does that mean? Blah, 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 blah. These are all people, I think, who just looked at it and said, I can't do this. They didn't even try. That's the point. And then he was supposed to be premiered in some place. I'm not going to mention the actual times, but he did write it, birthday present for Ludoslavsky's 80th birthday. So it was going to be in a concert for them. And he got news back from the actual performer who was going to play, who was played a German instrument. And even though this was still handwritten with his fingering, with his only flat, he got back and says, I can't play the multiphonic because this is French fingering. So Carter called me up and very distraught, because he was thinking, well, if you can't do it on a German clarinet, maybe I have to recompose the whole piece. Because, you see, that multiphonic is not something that he just picked out of the air and said, I'm just going to use it. Structurally in this piece. And this is why it's very important, if you're a performer, to actually be able to see music as structure. So it's not simply randomly this and randomly that somehow put together and you make a piece out of it. So this particular multiphonic written F sharp, C sharp, very important in terms of the actual trajectory of the piece. You need those two notes, you see. So he was very distraught that it's to redo the whole piece. This is too very complicated to do after he had written it. So I thought at the time, well, I should actually say, if it were now or more recently, I would have told him immediately what to do, because I know how to play German instruments as well. I know probably better than many people who play them. I know these instruments. But at the time wasn't so sure, but I thought that it has to work because it is a 12th, you see. And that is the fundamental initial overtones acoustical structure of the clarinet. So if you have a 12th, you have to be able. So it has to be some other fingering. So at that time, I was on my way to Japan when he mentioned this to me in a phone call. And so I thought, well, let me get a German instrument and try. So I got a Yamaha German system clarinet, and I found out that you just change one finger and it actually worked. You see, now I understand why it works with that one finger change. So if there are other multiphonics, I can tell easily how to adapt to one instrument, one system or the other. But so I sent it back to him, the new fingering, and Boozy and Hawkes published it, but incorrectly. So the whole thing is incorrect. So anyway, this was the beginning of our relationship. Then a little while after this, there was I was back in New York. I think this was in the fall of '93. There was a concert of Carter's music, including Boston premiere of Gras, supposed to be. But I should also mention before this, though, it was supposed to be premiered in this birthday concert of Ludoslavsky, but it wasn't played. So actually, it turns out that I played the premiere in Japan, in a concert that's sort of sponsored by the American Embassy. Now I go back to this next part. This was a concert in Boston by a new music group called Musica Viva. It's an important new music group, and they did the Carter concert. And this was the day before the concert. I got a phone call from Elliot Carter's wife, Helen, who's also a very remarkable person. And she said that the clarinet player who was going to play for the member of the group, the ensemble, he was going to play, actually fell down and broke his jaw or something of that sort, so he couldn't play. This was the day before, and there were several pieces on that program with big clarinet parts, including the piece of Elliot Carter called Triple Duo, and another one with singer called A Mirror on Which to Dwell, and then on some other pieces as well. And he said, well, she asked me, well, do you think you can play this concert? Because also Gras was on it. And I said, well, I'm not sure I should be the person because I never played Triple Duo or A Mirror on Which to Dwell. I played some other works of Carter, but not those pieces. And so I was, of course, very honest, about this, and I went about and tried to find somebody else. Nobody could do it. Who I had. So when I look back, I thought this is really nuts. So finally, I did call her back and says, okay. I said, okay, I will do this, but I have a problem because I'm teaching. At that time, I was teaching at the State University of New York at Stony Brook. It's in Long Island. It's not so far, not so close to New York City. I say, so I'm teaching. So I can probably get on a shuttle to go to Boston after I finish teaching in time for the concert, but I don't know if I can be there for rehearsal. They said, okay, but we have no choice. You have to do it. So I said, okay. Now, if I think back, I would say now, I just cancel my teaching, but I don't know why. I thought I shouldn't cancel my teaching. It was really ridiculous, sort of. So here I went there. Then I was able to get on a plane shuttle from New York to Boston for that. We got there. I got there. The concert was at 8. I think I got there 7:45. So in the meantime, I said, well, since I don't know these pieces, maybe you can fax the clarinet part to me, because this was the time of fax machine. So I was able to, so the morning of that day, I was going, before I left for Stony Brook, I was able to get the fax. And then I was teaching, so I couldn't look at it so quickly. Then I looked at it on during the flight. It was about an hour going to Boston. So I looked at the music list. And I thought, well, okay, I think I can do it. And the triple duo also has part for E-flat clarinet and bass clarinet. You ought to play 3 different clarinets. And I said that, well, before I said, well, I could do it. I can bring my E-flat clarinet, but I don't think I can carry a bass also and all this stuff. So if they could have a bass clarinet for me, that would be good. So they did. The ensemble agreed that there would be a bass for me. So anyway, I looked at the music. I went and I got there, and they postponed the start of the actual concert so they could go over both the 2 big pieces with me, at least, triple duo and A Mirror on Which to Dwell, before the concert. So I at least had some experience to play them. And I played the concert, and that those 2 big pieces were actually conducted. You see, which makes things a lot easier, because you can, even though this was basically very new to me, those 2 pieces that you can see what the beat is, and then I can hear well enough to understand, even though the pieces are complex, basically what is happening. So I basically sight read these pieces during the concert and played the Boston premiere of Gras as well. And after the concert, the Carters were there, both Elliot Carter and Helen there. At that time, my wife, Ayako, was also a wonderful clarinet player, was there as well. And so after the concert, the 4 of us, Carter wanted to take all of us out to dinner. But close to the hall, the only kind of quasi-restaurant, there were no actually real restaurants there. The only sort of place that was open was called Pizzeria Uno, this kind of chain pizza place. So here we went with Elliot Carter, one of the greatest composers, not only of the 20th century, but of all time, as I would say. We went to Pizzeria Uno to have our post-concert dinner. It's really funny. We were there. And that began our great friendship. And since then, that I've played so many pieces of Carter, and he wrote a wonderful duet for Ayako and myself called Hioku, for 2 clarinets. And also his second woodwind quintet for my quintet, the New York Woodwind Quintet.